Not yet.
Yeah.
Is there any other way to I'm just starting It's all on the fly.
Oh, yeah. You just want to give me a piece of the flyer. I don't know what to say.
I print it out.
It's just the room.
Hello, how are you? Good to see you. Very good to see you. Yeah. So what do you have to? Okay. Okay, I think we're going to get started in just a second here. So my name is Mitchell Orenstein. Am I on here? Is everything happening?
I don't think so.
And well, I think everybody can hear me. I was just concerned because I think we're streaming this. Is that correct?
Right. Try tapping the mic.
So does it matter? Okay. All right, and the streaming, I assume, is started? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So welcome, everybody. My name is Mitchell Orenstein. I'm a professor and chair of Russian and East European Studies here at the University of Pennsylvania. And I'm really pleased to welcome you to this event, which is a discussion with our own Claire Finkelstein, professor, or the Algernon Biddle Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy, who will be chairing the discussion, or moderating rather the discussion between herself and Wojciech Sadurski, who's written an excellent book that is the subject of this talk, Poland's Constitutional Law Crisis. And joining the discussion also is Dan Kelemen, Professor of Political Science and Law, and also Chair of the Department of Political Science at Rutgers University. So this is a real treat today. Professor Sadurski is the Challis Professor in Jurisprudence at the University of Sydney in Australia, and therefore is not always available to give a talk in person like this. However, he also holds a position of professor in the Center for Europe in the University of Warsaw, And he has been a visiting professor at a number of US and European institutions, including the University of Trento in Italy. He taught for many years at the European University Institute. He is at Cardozo School of Law in New York. He's been a visiting professor at New York University Law School and Yale Law School. His work on the constitutional law crisis in Poland is especially important today in the European Union. Actually, I'm going to remove my mask so that maybe people can hear a little better. His work has been particularly prominent in Poland for a couple of reasons. One is that he's a well-known professor of constitutional law in Poland who has called out the government of Poland, the peace government of Poland, for its violations of rule of law vis-a-vis Polish constitution, but also in the context of the European Union. As you may know, the European Union has been trying, maybe not hard enough. I think Professor Kelemen has been a voice in that area, criticizing the EU for how hard it's trying to put pressure on Poland in this. But in that sense, the European Union has been putting pressure on Poland to sort of bolster the rule of law and to not undermine it by a variety of mechanisms, which I'm sure the speakers will discuss. In addition to that, Professor Sadurski has been targeted by the government of Poland through a number of civil and criminal complaints that they launched as a campaign, essentially of harassment against him for voicing his concern about the rule of law in Poland. These are spurious cases that have mostly been dismissed, but nonetheless catapulted him into widespread recognition in Poland as an important public intellectual in this area, as a public figure in this area, as well as in the European Union writ large. So he's become kind of I almost want to say the leading spokesperson for the rule of law in Poland. So to discuss this, to discuss his book, his recent book on rule of law in Poland, we have with us, as I mentioned, Professor Kelemen, who himself is a scholar of European law and has been extremely active in trying to draw attention to issues of constitutional law in Poland. And of course, Carey Finkelstein, who is the founder and academic director of the Center for Ethics and Rule of Law at the University of Pennsylvania, and whose book talk series this event forms part. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to Professor. Now, are you going to speak? You're going to give a presentation for a few minutes, is that correct?
Yes.
And then we'll have a discussion. Okay. So he will give a presentation just to orient us around this, and then there'll be a discussion between the three faculty about it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So first of all, I want to thank very, very warmly my hosts here, that is Professor Finkelstein and Professor Orenstein. Thank you so much for inviting me. Well, on thanks to this impressive sounding list of universities with which I have had great honor to be associated, I need to add one of which I'm a cooperation with which I'm particularly proud, and which is going on right now, and that is Rutgers. And I want to thank Professor Dan Kelemen, who is also, in addition to his scholarly work, including on Central and Eastern Europe, he's currently head of Department of Political Science at Rutgers, and he's my host during my US visit this time. So I wouldn't have come to Pennsylvania today if I hadn't been invited to Rutgers in the first place. So thank you to these two great academic institutions. Now, what I'm going to do, as agreed with Professor Finkelstein, I'll speak for no more than 20 minutes, just to go a very, very brief overview of the issues, and then we'll be having the discussion about which Professor Orenstein has just mentioned. So what I'm going to do is, let me anticipate that at the end, I would like to make some remarks about the relevance of Putin's war against Ukraine. It's impossible these days to talk about anything related to Central and Eastern Europe, and Poland in particular, without mentioning, this big elephant in the room, and that is Russian invasion. So I will come back to it, and hopefully we will also continue by discussing this issue. But let me first make some points about the ostensible subject matter of this meeting, which is revisiting the book that I published already nearly 3 years ago, called Poland's Constitutional Background. And here the matter is quite simple. As an author, I'm pleased to say, although as a citizen, I regret to say that the book hasn't lost any of its validity. And that unfortunately, the only thing that can be said is everything is the same, except there is more of it. So it sounds actually better the Polish that say, but unfortunately, all the negative issues, all the negative phenomena and developments have been only enhanced since the book was out. The book was published in mid-2019, and since then, the rule of PIS, peace, which is Polish acronym for the Law and Justice Party, became consolidated as a result of 2 sets of elections which happened then. So there was electoral affirmation of the rule of this, what I call now populist authoritarian party, and the ruler Jarosław Kaczynski and his sort of favorite politicians or helper, Prime Minister Morawiecki. There were 2 sets of elections, late in 2019 parliamentary elections, in which this sort of hold on power was a little bit weakened, but just a little bit, by losing the Senate, which is now controlled by the thinnest of majorities by the opposition. But the Senate has a relatively secondary role in Polish bicameral system. And actually the raw vote of peace, of law and justice, was even larger than in 2015 elections when they returned to power. So after a long period in opposition. And then this confirmation of rule of peace was again, this rule was reconfirmed in the presidential elections, which happened a year later, when again with a very weak majority, but majority, and in presidential elections, of course, the winner takes all, so it doesn't matter what was his lead. Andrzej Duda, that party's candidate and incumbent, won again in what may have been seen free and relatively fair election. Relatively is, of course, an important proviso. They were not as unfair as the elections this Sunday in Hungary will be, and we all know about the whole system in which the election system is rigged. But we already know that the presidential elections weren't all that fair. There was, just as in presidential election, a shameless use of state TV. By the way, I should declare, my accuser and also plaintiff in a civil defamation case against me, which was spent basically into governmental propaganda and propaganda for the incumbent. And now we know that there was also a phone hacking of the campaign leadership of the opposition, sort of Watergate Polish style, with the use of sort of Pegasus system. So the free, yes, and probably not rigged afterwards. No one claimed, and no one even less demonstrate any electoral fraud, but not really fair for the reasons mentioned here. So the system now has emerged after these 2 sets elections, may be called a consolidated authoritarian populism. And all three words are important in the descriptor. It is consolidated because under the usual definitions in political science of consolidated system, say definitions by Sadurski or by Takis Papas or other scholars who wrote about democracy and failures of democracies, if you have two consecutive elections of populists in power, it becomes consolidated. And this consolidation has a number of important effects. I just want to mention the third one in this bullet point. The third bullet point has important socio-psychological effect. People get accommodated to live with the regime. Many people actually get to their adult lives knowing no other system than that. They learn to live with the regime, and there is also a well-known phenomenon. Here I'm paraphrasing, or actually citing Daniel Moynihan, an idea of defining pathology down. That is more or less normalizing or naturalizing, if you like, all sorts of political pathologies, which are now taken for granted because we don't remember any other system than that. So that's an aspect of consolidation. Then it is consolidated authoritarian system because we have had further personalization, personalization of power in the hands of the ultimate leader, of Kaczynski, who, if anything, managed to further strengthen his control over the entire political system. For reasons of biology, these are his last years in power, no doubt. Nevertheless, it seems that although there have been some blunders in recent years, in recent months, even days, with his unfortunate performance in Kiev in a famous visit, nevertheless, he controls the power very firmly. And we know there are some conflicts among his potential successors, but it all looks pretty much in control. So this is authoritarian aspect. It's a populist system because it still gets a lot of support for its socioeconomic policies, basically social or economic transfers operate in a very simple way, but with an immediate gratification, namely through cash payments based on the number of children you have. So it's consolidated authoritarian populism. In addition, it became more and more ideological. So in the study of populism, there was a popular saying that populism is only thinly ideological. But I'm sorry to say that Polish version of populism becomes more and more ideological, with very strong element of anti-modernism, largely due to the synergy between the political rule and the Catholic Church in Poland, xenophobia, which before the Ukrainian war was very skillfully oriented against potential immigrants and populists, mainly from Middle East and Afghanistan, and the usual populist anti-elite type of ideology. Despite the fact that peace, the law and justice, and Kaczynski are having now very much the elite for the last 5 years, nevertheless, they managed to present themselves as being anti-mainstream, anti-elite, the voice of real people. Now, one thing which since I'm a lawyer and a constitutional lawyer, that what I want to mention is something that I haven't really developed that comprehensively in my book. But then we have already seen the contours of deep and comprehensive institutional reconstruction of the system. So beyond, under the surface of constitutional provisions, which largely do not matter, in reality we have had a suite, if you like, of strategies aimed at institutional rebuilding. And I identify in a little book which I'm now completing, which which I'll mention at the end of this presentation, I identify five, this is not an exhaustive list, but five main methods of institutionally reconstructing the state without constitutional change, because they have no constitutional majority, in contrast to Viktor Orban in Hungary so far. So one is capture. Basically, this is by placing your own people in the old institutions, like in courts, in constitutional tribunal, Supreme Court. So it's simply the simplest sort of, if you like, personnel replacement. Secondly, duplication. In addition to constitutionally prescribed institutions, you add new institutions by statutes, which more or less replace in power the old institutions. The media board would be an example of that. Erosion, that is reducing both powers and mainly budgets of the institutions which you cannot transform. The office of ombudsman would be an example. What I call migration, that is transferring an institution without visibly changing its shape, but to a new institutional context in which it requires a completely different, if you like, profile. The public prosecutor's office, which before 2015 was reasonably independent, now became part of the structure of the Ministry of Justice. And finally, important internal restructuring, for example, within the parliament, within the, say, operation of the committees, which take part in drafting legislation. So when you put all these things together, you see that that they have actually built a brand new state without constitutional change, which is quite a feat, and in that sense, they have been quite effective. There is also, I like this photo, so I'm sorry about little bit self-centered or how should I say, megalomaniac aspect of this slide. But here, a friend of mine, a Dutch lawyer who came to observe the trial and whom Dan Kelemen knows very well, John Moraine, was an observer at one of my cases in Warsaw, and he took this photo. Forget the guy in the middle there, but this is a beautiful badge constitution. And it has very special sort of meaning in Polish language, because those sort of two syllables of the word, of the Polish word constitutions, mean you and me. So that basically an idea as constitution is something which belongs to the real people rather than being something purely formal and official. Okay, so here is an issue I described in these three bullet points, some of the main, but by far not all, measures of what came to be known as discriminatory legalism, best encapsulated in this famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, whereas of Peruvian president of early 20th century, everything for my friends, for my enemies, the law. And Polish populist authoritarians are very happy to use legal means, but in an extremely selective, hence discriminatory way. They don't employ the law when their people, including Kaczynski himself, may be suspected of some wrongdoing, but they are very enthusiastic about throwing the books at their enemies. And the most worrying aspect of it is the third bullet point, that is open legal harassment of judges, recalcitrant, critical, independent judges. And those few public prosecutors who try to maintain their integrity. And this point sort of like triggers a European issue, which I won't be mentioning here for the absence of time. So coming to the end of my remarks, if there is someone in the room who is not terribly interested in Poland as such, which it pains me, I have to acknowledge that for some people Poland is not the center of the world, although it is, isn't it? Of course. What are the general lessons that this unfortunate Polish case study may sort of warrant. And I would suggest only two, although there are much more if I had more time. So the one is that it seems that the phenomenon, which may be called elected authoritarians, that is, authoritarian rulers who nevertheless enjoy real electoral legitimacy, with all the caveats which I have mentioned about possible unfairness. And there are many of them, not just Kaczynski and not just Orban. I mean, think about Bolsonaro, think about Erdogan, think about Duterte, or think about Modi. So this is a worldwide phenomenon of these populists, but certainly elected authoritarians seems to be an unfortunately reasonably stable phenomenon, which sort of undermines one of the huge paradigms in political science and democracy theory of post-1989, that we enter into the transitional period. Transition being a point from whatever the unwholesome old system was, whether it was communism or apartheid or military dictatorship or East Asian authoritarians, etc. And then there is a reasonably smooth transition from A to B, B being liberal democracy. Now we see that it was extremely naive and that this system, which we see, this hybrid type of not very oppressive, but certainly not very democratic system, is there to stay. And the second point, which is more in my professional field, is something that many of my constitutional law scholars abhor to admit, but that constitutional designs count for relatively little. Because if you look at Polish constitutional design, with very tiny marginal objections, which you as a liberal, rights-respecting constitutional Democrat might have, is reasonably strong and good. You know, it sort of meets the best practices of democratic constitution. But it doesn't matter. The constitution doesn't count. You know? So our usual discussions about constitutional design, which presuppose that constitutional design is all important for the health of democracy, I think we must be much more probably skeptical. And then at the very end, let me ask a question about Ukraine. How has the Putin's war, it's Russia war, but mainly Putin's war against Ukraine, how will it impact Polish hybrid democracy or Polish authoritarian populism? So I won't be mentioning anything about, say, the issues of immigrants, although it's obviously extremely important. There are 2 million of them now, and now more. And strategic military issues. I'm just interested in those democratic aspects. So, and sorry about banality of what I'll say, but it's certainly much too early to tell. But I think that we have already seen two divergent effects or tendencies triggered by Putin's war. So one is that, like any war, this is great reinforcement of the government. It's normal. It's everywhere. The case the rallying around the flag is an obvious phenomenon. It's almost a God-given gift to his government, including in its dealings with European Union. But there is also an opposite trend, and that is that at least some of us, and it's unfortunately not a majority view, but it's a view which I and many of my friends and colleagues try to get across that message, that especially in times such as this, in times of trauma, crisis, danger, and war, you need to be even more vigilant about the government than in good times or natural times, because they have incentives and opportunity to do all the dirty tricks which they had been planning, and now in the disguise or the shadow of war, they can do even faster. So, for example, although they say now is the time, now is not the time, now is not the right time to talk about the rule of law and democracy and so on. But they don't behave like it. I mean, now is the time when they do many dirty things. President Duda keeps appointing pseudo judges to courts, including the Supreme Court. The so-called National Council of Judiciary, which is a unconstitutional body in Poland, is now being reconstituted. They start talking about constitutional amendments and so on. So, you have to actually be very careful about what they are trying to do. And in this context, I would say that the fact that when President Biden was in Warsaw and his important speech to the world, was framed in the context of competition between autocracy and democracy. It may be very important, if you like, argumentative asset for Polish democrats. He quite deliberately framed it not so much in strategic military or even economic context, but autocracy versus democracy. And many people say, look, the difference between authoritarianism, Polish style, and especially Hungarian style, and Putin's authoritarianism is a matter of degree, rather than. But they are on the same trajectory. So now that I have finished, and to take let me take a very short commercial break and advertise to you shamelessly the book that is about to appear in 2 months, much better price than the one which we have seen here, because there will be paperback for just under $30. I behave a little bit as a salesman here, which is called The Pandemic of Populism, where I look not just at Poland, but obviously Poland is one of my main case studies, and those issues which I have just presented will be developed there more explicitly. Thank you. What should I do with the screen? Sorry. Thank you very much.
So Claire Finkelstein will moderate now a discussion with the author and Mr. Monnet.
Wonderful, thank you. I don't know whether or not our voices are able to be picked up since we're not mic'd.
I think so.
Yes, we should be good. Okay, all right, wonderful. That was a terrific summary and pushing beyond the book. And I want to start by going back to some of the central ideas of the book, which for me was very, in a way, poignant to read because of certain changes that I see happening in the U.S. as well. So I want to ask you about that. But let's talk first about the nature of constitutional backsliding. What is constitutional backsliding? What are the hallmarks of constitutional backsliding? How do we know when we're in a democratic system that is starting to backslide? And I'm going to get Dan in this in just a second, but let me just invite you maybe to say a few words about that.
Yes, so thank you very much.
And then turn to Dan.
So let me just jump very briefly, because I'm really interested in hearing both you and Dan. Backsliding is a fundamental concept because both for constitutional lawyers and for political scientists, path dependence matters. And it makes a big difference whether the country is a state is a hybrid democracy, but more or less has stayed on that at that point for a number of years and is in some sort of plateau, or whether the state, so to speak, degenerated from a much better, never perfect, but much better democratic quality than it is now. In the latter case, where we have this clearly downwards project, as you have in those states which I mentioned, but now for our discussion in Poland, it is very important. There are institutional memories of good democratic practice. There are people around who remember that. But there is also a sense of disenchantment and disappointment. While in the countries which you, political scientists, study and know much better than others do, but which sort of remain at a certain level with small amplitudes of difference, like China, there isn't this aspect of backsliding. No one can talk about Chinese backsliding because it was never democratic in the members. Right? So that's why I mentioned backsliding. What are the criteria of backsliding? Look, I love a beautiful metaphor in Levitsky and Ziblatt book when they say when authoritarians come to power and start operating with backsliding, even I'm not sure they use this word, well, they will do three things. They change the rules of the game, they replace the umpires, and they try to sideline their opponents. A little bit like in sport, So they change rules of the game, either by constitutional change or by those sub-constitutional changes I described. They replace the umpires, basically pack the courts, with their judges. And finally, they sideline their opponents, for example, by marginalizing, demonizing, stigmatizing the opposition.
Yeah, so Dan, let me ask you the same question, since you're obviously very knowledgeable in this area as well. You have a lot of thinking about it. What to you is either democratic backsliding or constitutional backsliding?
Well, Wojciech, I think, gave a very good explanation, and I suppose what I could add is just to emphasize that it's a multi-dimensional concept because a government or a country can experience backsliding, let's say, in terms of the independence of the judiciary or other institutions that are supposed to be independent. It can experience backsliding in the fairness of elections and those kind of electoral dimensions. It can experience backsliding in the protection of fundamental rights and freedoms that are necessary for democracy, things like freedom of the press, academic freedom. So, and then when you look at the specific cases of backsliding, which, by the way, is a broad trend around the world, when you look at ratings bodies like Biddle that rate regime types. In fact, I just saw that now the kind of average scores are back to where they were in '89, so sort of 30 years have been lost in a global sense, right? But when you look at specific cases, some backslide more on certain dimensions than others. So since Professor Sadurski was talking, of course, about Poland and making a lot of comparisons with Hungary, just even in those cases, we can see differences where really the primary target in Poland was the judiciary. And of course, state media, other things, but really the judiciary was front and center, more so than it was in Hungary. The judiciary was also captured in Hungary largely, and prosecution services are captured, but a lot of the attacks there were even more focused on private media and academic institutions, civil society. So yeah, that I think tries to encapsulate the breadth of the phenomenon.
Yeah, so one of the biggest hallmarks of constitutional backsliding is an attack on law.
Exactly.
Attack on the rule of law, attack on the concept of law, and the degree to which the notion of law can supply the guardrails on our democracy, on democracy in general. There's some other institutional changes, and you emphasize a lot of those. But one of them is the erosion of checks and balances. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time, and I apologize if some of the lens through which I look at this is a very American concerned lens. Of course, we're all used to thinking of checks and balances as absolutely fundamental to democracy. And one question I have is whether or not it is. But whether or not you can have a democratic system that actually function along different lines. But when you have a system built around checks and balances, and you see an erosion of those checks and balances, whether they're ultimately necessary or not, that's a big red flag, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. So perhaps the most fundamental, the shortest description of erosion of constitutional democracy in Poland is the de facto abandonment of separation of powers, or checks and balances, which are sort of two two ways of describing a similar
Besides the
thing.
same point.
Yes, exactly. They are two sides of the same coin. Checks and balances, more American style, dispersing the powers, separation of powers is more part of the European continental language. But we are talking about one and the same, which is that there should be balanced government, mixed government, and that no single institution or person should be able to monopolize the entire government. That's exactly what happened in Poland, where the separation of powers has been all but abandoned, even though it is formally declared and announced in the constitution. Because we have different European models of separation of powers, and some people believe that, say, the UK model, the Westminster model, in which the executive is more or less merged with the legislature because the head executive is always the winner of the winning party, and therefore they control the parliament. That this is some form of erosion of separation of powers, but at least in the UK, it is more than counterbalanced by long constitutional and political culture, of which perhaps even the Queen may be seen as part, which sort of prevents the worst breaches. No such informal guarantees exist in Poland.
What do you see, Dan, as the role of separation of powers and checks and balances in the preservation of
It would be a good idea.
democracy?
Yes, I think, certainly the dispersal of power can play that role, but I think, frankly, if you want to make a parallel with US, I think, honestly, federalism probably is more powerful in that respect than the horizontal separation of powers, just because
At least these days.
it's hard for an aspiring autocrat in our country to capture enough states to rig the whole system and really consolidate control, to use that term, consolidation, I think. Whereas, I think in a country like Poland or the Hungarian example, which I also brought up, while there were norms of the judiciary should be independent, et cetera, once a government had a strong majority and was willing to ignore all informal norms, it found that it could, it in essence got away with just steamrolling over those separations that were supposed to be respected.
So another phenomenon that we see, and then we'll sort of do the overview of the different areas of erosion, is attack on the courts and the lack of independence of the courts, anywhere from court packing to agenda setting to trying to control the operation of the court. So can you describe that a little bit, how that has, your book is beautifully describes this phenomenon, but for those who may not have read it, how did that occur in Poland, and sort of where is it now since 2018 when we finished drafting this?
Yes. So to put it in a very sort of schematic or simplified way, the assault of the executive upon the courts proceeded in two stages, which were sort of chronologically quite distinct from each other. The first stage was an all-out assault upon constitutional tribunal. And you must know that in Poland, justice in almost all European continental states, constitutional judiciary is completely separate from the regular judiciary. So it's not like the Supreme Court of the United States, which at the same time is the apex court of appeal, but also plays the functions of constitutional review, which has sort of usurped in 1803 to itself. But in Europe, we have what is called Kelemen system. There's a separate court, single court, which deals only with constitutional review, very powerful. Very powerful, but also very easily to capture, because much easier to pack and capture a body of 15 judges than, like in Poland, we have 10,000 so-called regular common judges. So the first target was constitutional tribunal, which became very easy to capture, and it took exactly 1 year, from December 2015 to December 2016, before constitutional tribunal was there, when they got majority of judges from constitutional tribunal, partly through various dirty tricks, by introducing improperly elected judges, and partly by natural attrition, the term of, because it's a limited term in contrast to the US Supreme Court, the terms of judges came to, many judges came to an end, and they managed to place their own judges because they are appointed by the Parliament. So, as from late 2016, Constitutional Tribunal was there. Now, by the way, it's 100% cut. All 50 judges are peace or pro-government judges. And that was very important because it disabled the only institution which could object to unconstitutional statutes. So the whole 2016 was this protracted struggle over this. But for them, it was absolute prerequisite for their change to have their own constitutional tribunal, which would rubber stamp every single bill that they placed, and they did it. And in fact, they not just rubber stamp, but they helped the government in many ways, which I also describe in my book, help lower the cost of bringing in unconstitutional law. Now, the second stage, which started around mid-2017, was an assault on all other judges, on all other courts, starting with the Supreme Court, which is separate from the Constitutional Tribunal. It wasn't so easy, and it's not yet fully fixed. They managed to capture the majority of the Supreme Court by now, and in particular the office of the Chief Justice of the Court, and also to place new chambers, which means also their judges into the court. So it's more or less done. When it comes to regular judges, so judges at first instance and also appeal, etc., most of them maintain a degree of integrity, even though not independence, because there are all sorts of disciplinary actions, also mechanisms related to promotion, advancement, but also discharge, etc., which place them at the mercy of Minister of Justice. So this is a very simplified picture.
And there's some other important hallmarks, such as court packing, right? We had a chance to talk about that earlier, as well as the issue of whether or not opinions are published. Can you talk a little bit about those issues?
Yeah, I will. And then if I could, I want to throw a question based on that to Wojciech.
Sure.
But yeah, I think it was quite striking in your book, which, by the way, I haven't said, by the way, congratulations. It's just an incredible book, and I think it will be very important in the long run, because although there's been a lot of writing about this process of constitutional capture, articles, occasional blog posts, things, this is really the only book I've seen, and it does it so well. It encapsulates this key moment in the history of Polish democracy, or slide away from democracy. So kudos to you. But yeah, I think some of those phenomena that you described so well are, which are really striking, and it kind of boggles the mind that some of the techniques that the peace government used in the process of capturing the Constitutional Tribunal, when they hadn't quite captured it yet, they just started doing things like not publishing its rulings, right? It's sort of the same. Well, it's this notion that it doesn't, rulings don't take legal effect until they're published in the sort of official register, right? And so if the existing judges who were trying to hold out for the independence of that body when the process of capture is going on, they would issue a ruling sort of defending their own independence against the government, and the government would just say, well, we control the printing press, for the government, so we just won't print it so that it's not, we can just pretend it never happened. Sort of, I think that, kids do stick your fingers in your ears, close your eyes, it's not happening. That's essentially what, based on that, if I could turn a question back to Wojciech about this, I guess I was really intrigued by your lessons section at the end of the talk, and one of the last points you made, said maybe a lesson of this for other countries is that constitutional design doesn't matter in the end. And so just on this issue that Professor Finkelstein brings up about capture, I guess my question to you is this. I can see two lessons that scholars of the intersection of law and politics, two perspectives they might have on what happened. One might be to say, Well, the lesson of this is that one has to make constitutional courts even more insulated and more protected and more powerful, so that if a party with this agenda comes to power, some other country, or in the future someday, if democracy is restored, well, that court will be able to withstand. So that would be one lesson, right? Further insulation, further judicial power. But then on the other hand, the sort of Jeremy Waldrons or Richard Bellamy's of this world, and critics of judicial review and judicial power, they might look at it and say, well, actually what it shows is it doesn't matter how powerful you make it, because the Polish court was pretty powerful, right? In the end, they're just going to steamroller it. So then what's the point of trying to have powerful courts? That just makes them more of a target, right? And so don't bother. So I guess I just wonder, what do you think? What is the lesson now?
Yeah, well, I'm in neither camp, so I don't believe that even further strengthening of constitutional tribunal would have made it much more resilient. It would have made it a little more resilient. Perhaps, the design of election of court by majority of the parliament is better. It is better to have it French style or Italian style, with different bodies which have their sort of quota on the court. So it's not as easy to dominate. But then you have Germany, which is also appointed by the parliament, and it's resilient. So much depends on non-constitutional aspects. So we can expose, sort of ruminate about what would be better ways of constitutional design, but in the end, constitution is nothing but a parchment paper. And if there is a committed political force which is prepared to breach the constitution, then nothing will save a constitutional tribunal. And then I don't go into the other opposite, to the Wogan Bellamy thing, which basically says, well, the rights are best defended with the absolute supremacy of the legislature and judges. Sort of, I won't be even paraphrasing this argument, but let's have political constitutions, which has an epitome in the sovereignty of the supremacy of the parliament, rather than giving judges decisions over constitutional rights, because constitutional rights are subject to these rules. I believe that in most cases judges should have power of constitutional review, and here I may say, I told you so, not you, but my Polish audience, because many years ago when I started writing on constitutional courts, I sort of regretted that we already would have introduced this sort of Kelsenian system, because I suspected it would be very easy to capture. And also I didn't trust all these people all that much, because I had known them, some of them were my friends and colleagues in law faculty. But I thought that a dispersed model, US style, or Indian style, which plays a very important role, but which doesn't separate between constitutional and regular judiciary, would be better. And the Polish constitution actually allows for a dispersed system of judicial review, except that it hasn't been exercised so far, because judges were told that this is not their business because the constitutional tribunal. But the Polish constitution directly explicitly says that it is being enforced and applicable directly. In other words, every single judge has a duty to apply the Constitution, and to apply Constitution with precedence to the statutes if they find that there is inconsistency. But they haven't been doing it.
But this is interesting, Wojciech. You take a very pessimistic view, namely, if there was a will to dismantle democracy, it will happen, and no amount of structure, checks and balances, judicial oversight, and so on can change that. And I think there was a hint in what you said, Dan, that maybe the structure does matter, at least up to a certain point. So if you look at the history of the U.S. Supreme Court, up to a point, we could see this as a success story. And part of it is the publicity of the opinions, the fact that you have to give reasoned arguments for what you're doing, reasoning with the tools of democratic governance, that you are applying a system and making decisions that oversee in some ways the boundaries of democracy of the other branches, but without the sword, right, to enforce this. So particular structure, up to a point, it seemed as though helped, number one, enforce individual rights to an extraordinary degree in this country. Imagine the civil rights movement without the Supreme Court is hard to do in this country. And there was a flurry of writing about, how dangerous this was, right? And the moment, et cetera, stuff comes out of that saying, well, this overshadows the legislature. Now what we find, and these people who are concerned about the overriding power of the Supreme Court might sing a different tune these days. Because now what we find is both the legislature and the court taking a backseat to the executive branch. And so I wonder how we see those developments all across Europe, which have an amazing commonality to them. Weakening both legislatures and court systems. And what explains the sheer consistency of this experience at this moment in time, which you might not have said 40 years ago.
Yeah, well, I suppose I think the biggest threats to democracy and the rule of law ultimately come from executives, right? And I think the various institutions you're describing, Professor Finkelstein used the term for guardrails, and that's precisely what they are. But guardrails, it's a nice metaphor because we all know it from driving, and one thing it sort of implies is, they keep you on the road. But if you try to drive a Mack truck straight over the guardrail,
right.
Eventually, it's not a guarantee, but they do tend to keep you on the road. And I guess when part of your question is why do we see these attacks happening in so many countries in Europe? And I think that gets to the populist part of his trifecta there, right? That there's just a surge of populist parties and support for them. There's a deep story behind that about dissatisfaction with democracy in many European countries, stemming largely from economic concerns, I think, of voters where they feel dissatisfied with kind of the economic consequences of neoliberalism in recent decades. And so there's a search for alternatives. And you have populists, usually on the right, a few on the left, who offer, these sort of simplistic solutions and promises of but I think one thing about them, and I think Professor Sadurski, you're getting this, these populist parties inevitably run headlong into the courts because part of their agenda is to say, we are the only true voice of the popular will, and none of these elites like judges or technocrats can stand in the way. And there's some great phrases that came up in the Polish context. You can remind us about, that no judges can stand in the way of the will of the people, kind of thing. And that's just inherent in those populist movements. And so I think that's why we see heightening tensions between politics and law in many countries because of this sort of populism.
Yes, so of course I just want to make 2 points. So the first point is that the concept about relative unimportance or irrelevance of constitutional design is sort of deliberately provocative. I mean, I've been earning my money all my life teaching constitutions. If I started a class in comparative constitutions by saying to my students, constitutions don't matter, then I would be some sort of on false pretenses there. What am I doing there? But the relative is an object. And just as you said, up to a point, institutions protect about guardrails, etc. And I agree, and it's up to a point. And everything depends on the intensity of political, mainly executive challenge. If they are committed to it, and moreover, if as in populists ingredient on it, which then just referred, they feel that they have a sizable support, if not by majority, at least by a strong plurality of people, they don't care about it. So there is a great example that Dan brought in his earlier entry here, and that is about federalism. I mean, federalism is an extremely important mechanism of protection of liberties and democracy. But, insofar as it works in the United States, even though the federal scholars who probably have many caveats that it works in Germany, doesn't work in India. India was a working, good, strong federal state. And now Modi doesn't have to care about, what do particular states say. So that's an example. And the second point I want to make, well, why are courts such an obvious first target of every authoritarian, including populist? Of course, it's because courts may stand in the way, but most importantly, because to populists, courts pose fundamental, if you like, ideological philosophical challenges, because they bring in a different type of political legitimacy. The legitimacy is not about electoral kind, not about accountability to the sovereign, to the population, etc., but it's more, as Martin Shapiro called it, a trial. This is an independent umpire between the two parties. All courts derive their legitimacy from something else than the consent of the general public. And populists cannot stand it because they say we represent the sovereign, we represent the people. So they cannot tolerate any other source, whether it's epistemic legitimacy, because there are some scholars who know better, so that, Dr. Fauci knows something about virus than ex-President Trump didn't know. They can't tolerate that type of competition of different forms of legitimacy.
And let's add to that, it's not just the courts, of course, but the justice system on the whole. So if you look at the attacks on the independence of justice in the U.S., for example, one of the things that you would look at is the decline in independence of the Attorney General and the Department of Justice. You would look at attacks on the role of inspectors general. You would look at the fact that we no longer have an independent counsel statute, special prosecutor statute. And so when Robert Mueller was appointed, he had comparably less power than the special prosecutors would have under the special prosecutor statute. We find the willingness of the public to tolerate executive branch use of judicial concepts like dangling pardons and affecting what the Justice Department does with prosecutions, and we find prosecutions or refusal to prosecute used as a political tool and so on. So it's not just courts, but the entire justice system leading up to a case appearing in court. And I take it that that's part of the process that you saw in Poland.
Yes, absolutely. And so there are all these institutions which sort of surround, which create an environment for the system of justice, of which the institution of public prosecutor is particularly important, because traditionally in civil law countries, in traditional countries which emerge from communist states, this office, which is called, sometimes the Polish or Russian word is used in English, prokuratura, because prosecutors do not exactly, the word prosecutor, public prosecutor, does not exactly reflect the immense power that those prosecutors have, especially in the system which is much more inquisitorial than adversary than in the common law Anglo-American type of system. So this is an extremely important institution, and also it lends itself very easily to executive capture, because there is no such thing as judicial independence of prosecutors. They may be structured, and they are being now restructured, as basically a military, with a very, very clear chain of command from the top prosecutor up to the lowest, including on instructions to be given to prosecutors about whether to continue with pressing charges or not.
Yeah, I think one of the great things in the book, and it's a really crucial point you brought up, Professor Finkelstein, that we're not just talking about capture of judges, but capture of prosecution services and that aspect of the rule of law. And one of the great things in the book was, I think, Professor Sadurski, how you broke down these kind of stages, 2 key stages in the capture of the judicial system. The first stage was to kind of neutralize it so it couldn't stop the regime from pursuing its agenda. But then once it had been captured, then turning it into a weapon, right? That's, you gave the quote from Benavides, for, and for my friends, anything, for my enemies, the law, right? And so once you have these institutions, particularly prosecutors along with client courts, captured, then I think it's particularly important for these regimes like Poland or Hungary, which is even more advanced in this regard, which are these kind of hybrid regimes. As you said, they are autocracies, but they're not brutal dictatorships. Now, why is it so crucial? Because in a brutal dictatorship, you basically kill your opponents. You do things like that. You don't have to really maintain a pretense of law. Maybe you might have a little show trial for Navalny, but okay, but it's mostly just violence behind it. But in, I think, a regime like Poland, now that they have this apparatus, the regime will practice what Javier Corrales or Kim Shepla call autocratic legalism, where now they're going to say, okay, well, we got the whole legal apparatus, so we don't have to throw people in jail. We'll just basically prosecute them for tax violations or whatever kind of convenient things to shut down NGOs. Parties will violate the parties will sue opposition parties for violating various campaign rules, and we will basically persecute and antagonize our enemy while saying it's all legal.
Well, and this is so important when you look at the history of Nazi Germany and you see the Nuremberg codes, and then the outrage of the Nuremberg lawyers at having their racist laws supplanted by raw authoritarianism. It's like, wait a second, we have a rule of law system here, right? So, and there's a wonderful movie that depicts this called Conspiracy, which is a recreation of the Wannsee Conference. And so it's a stage on the way to, right? And so what I want to talk about, let's turn our attention a little bit to Russia, because we have this enormous example, as you say, the elephant in the room. Leading up to the invasion of Ukraine, we're all sort of rewriting history a little bit as we look at 5 years leading up to the invasion of Ukraine, when we have Russia funding far-right parties all over Europe and even in the US and elsewhere, engaging in an enormous amount of propaganda, trying to disaggregate NATO, trying to, in some ways, prepare the ground for a move like the invasion of Ukraine, and having enormous success, really, in creating a fertile ground, the populist backdrop, if you will, for something like the changes that we see in Poland. How much do you think it is Russia's doing, Russia's fault, or how much is it really Russia saw an opportunity that it was exploiting in the politics of a country like Poland, even more so than Hungary, and maybe even in the US?
I must confess I'm not a Russia scholar. I'm sure that Professor Orenstein will know much more about it. But let me make this point. I'm not sure that Russia has had very massive sort of secret operation type of involvement in Poland. Maybe because it wasn't easy to do, because Polish society is extremely anti-Russian. It's extremely Russophobic, which now seems like a good thing to do, but which was almost pathological before. And so no Polish rulers could get votes from being friends of Russia. You can only lose votes, so they don't. They have been obviously supporting some right-wing fundamentalist NGOs, like the most perhaps infamous of them all, Ordo Iuris, which is like extreme right-wing Catholic, whose heroes would be people like General Franco, Pinochet, etc. And they were supporting them, but it wasn't really, I think, massive. But But the second point I want to make about Russia is that when many people now, and we have the whole, of course, on the table, we have a great number of good theories which try to explain Putin's invasion, the causes of invasion, beyond pure individual folly, which I don't think is a great explanation unless you can get that. And one aspect, maybe not the dominant, but an important one, which is really, really underappreciated, is that the war for Putin is a powerful extra tool of increasing repression within the state. I mean, Putin, for all sorts of reasons, mainly economic, is reaching the stage in which his legitimacy will become very quickly eroded. And so, parallel with that, we have seen an increased authoritarianization, or whatever, increasingly repressive nature of Russian regime. Dan mentioned Navalny case. There are many, many cases like this. And I believe that if you look at his new laws, which were rubber stamped by the Duma, including you can't mention the war. You must have special military operations.
It's not a war.
It's not a war.
Yeah.
It's almost like, I don't know whether you remember the Faulty Towers episode, we don't mention the war. So it's almost like a similar type of trick. I think that this may be seen as one of the important causes for this otherwise counterproductive, not criminal of course, but counterproductive and strange action, which costs Russia so much.
And Tim, do you have any thoughts about this, the sort of Russian-inspired, Russian-funded increase in right-wing populism?
Well, yeah,
How much of an impact here?
well, it's had a huge impact across Europe, but Poland is kind of, as Professor Sadurski was saying, the exceptional case. So if we look at most of the right-wing populists, whether ones in government, such as Orban's Fidesz party, Orban is the best friend of Putin within the EU and has been his Trojan horse for years, as Professor Orenstein and I wrote about once. But beyond that, you have Rassemblement National in France. They did their banking with a bank close to Putin. Liga in Italy, obviously, is supported by Russia. So yes, Russia was supporting far-right populists all around Europe, trying to disrupt European democracies. But the one kind of exceptional case is Poland, where they didn't need any Russian intervention to have far-right populists take over.
But that's very important, isn't it? Because it tells you that it can happen without Russia.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I guess the one other thing I'd add just on the war in terms of the consequences for the situation in Poland, and I think Professor Sadurski was alluding to this, I think you'd agree with me, and I'm curious here, but essentially I think the war means the peace regime is going to get off the hook with the EU. So the EU, we haven't talked much about the EU, that's been my kind of focus on these issues, looking at the EU's response or lack of response to the erosion of rule of law and democracy in Poland and elsewhere. And there was some mounting pressure and some steps where the EU was getting a bit tougher with its kind of legal cases it was bringing and imposing fines on the Polish government for non-compliance. And there was talk of, well, they actually had suspended the disbursement of the COVID recovery funds to Poland and Hungary. So they had, because of rule of law issues, it was Polish government is ignoring the European Court of Justice rulings currently. And there was even talk of doing a further, applying another mechanism they have where they can suspend even more of the EU funding. Because keep in mind, this government we're talking about, which has done all this, is the biggest recipient of EU funding of any member state by far. So the EU, which is ironic because they're supposed to, they claim to be a union of democracies, promoting rule of law, but actually the EU is the biggest funder of democratic backsliding in the world because it pours money into Poland and Hungary and finances all of this. So there was talk about suspending some of that, but there was a long way to say, I think basically that's all going to go out the window now because I think some of the EU leaders think, well, it's really bad optics to suspend money when there's 2 million refugees in Poland, even if it's still justified on legal grounds. And frankly, they could suspend money, do things, and send some separate money just for refugees, so they could do it and still help the refugee situation. But I suspect politically, they're just going to think this is bad optics. We have to look like the enemy of our or I don't know, Poland's standing up to Putin, so we have to support them. So I think Poland's going to get off the hook.
Strikingly, when you talk about the unwillingness of Germany to at least partially join the sanctions and the insistence on the dependence on Russian oil and gas is really, really striking. So the fact that this hasn't hit home as, oh my God, Ukraine is defending democracy for all of Europe, which is the sentiment, in effect that would lead to the sympathy with Poland. It hasn't hit home.
I think that's right. And I think part of the optics, if you look at, let's say, the German leadership, because it wouldn't just be EU leaders decide these things, member states get involved, and they probably feel like, well, it would look bad if we got behind sanctioning Poland. Poland would say, well, look, we're dealing with these issues from Russia, and Germany's backing sanctions against us, right? So that would look bad. So that's why I think everyone's going to try to kick this issue into the long grass for a couple of years, and that might mean that will mean the assault on the judiciary, what's left of it, will just continue.
Yeah, so I agree with Dan on this, and I think that indeed the peace government will get off the hook quite easily. I can sense within the decision makers in the EU, especially in the Commission, that they desperately want to have some pretext to say, okay, Poland has fulfilled its requirements, here is the money, here is the disbursement of the recovery funds, post-COVID funds. They need to get something. So this is in their infinite hypocrisy. I think they will accept just changing of the name of the disciplinary chamber, just slightly restructuring and say, okay, fine, because they cannot, politically speaking, they cannot persist in being seen. We will insist on so-called conditionality. We will not disperse this fund. But there are millions of refugees, and also Poland takes a huge financial burden, not just about the immigrants, but also about its military capacity, etc. So we, people who are deeply upset about the breaches of the rule of law, we keep thinking about whether there is a way of targeted funding of refugee help and sort of channeling into NGOs and local governments rather than to the government. And I'm not sure, I'm not an expert in it. If it was possible, that would be optimal. But I think that in the end, the recovery funds will be released and dispersed, no matter what happens to charges.
I am overdue for getting the audience in on this conversation. My apologies. The floor is open. So anyone who wants to wade into the conversation, we also have an online audience. And wonderful. Thank you.
How can you reverse the slippage? Is there any going back?
Yes, there is. And interestingly enough, my first paper, which I gave at Professor Kelemen's department, was precisely on that. Now, the simple answer, and sorry, it won't be flippant, but it sounds almost flippant, is the opposition, current opposition, must win the election. Of course, it's much easier said than done. However, I do not see any other way, any revolutionary way, any putsch, any coup d'etat, any bringing in like foreign imported democracy to Poland, like it was done in East Timor or elsewhere. I mean, no. The Polish democratic opposition must win the election. There's no non-electoral way remedy to the current situation. And fortunately, in Poland, it's more likely than, say, in Hungary this Sunday, because Polish electoral system has not been so comprehensive and so shamelessly changed, eroded by the government. It still will be very difficult. And so we need to think about a large number of different strategies, or pre-electoral strategies. Because winning the election is not just about the election, but all the run-up to the election. all the important civil society action, NGOs, which by the way now come under increased pressure. These days in Poland, they will introduce, or they are planning to introduce a new law which will impose, which will sort of stigmatize NGOs which are foreign funded. You cannot get domestically funded NGOs, just like you cannot get them in, or at least democratic, pro-liberal NGOs. But so there is a whole set of strategies, and in these strategies, the EU membership also plays a role, not independent role, because neither Brussels nor Luxembourg nor Strasbourg will bring democracy to Poland. It can be only won by Poles, but they may help the democratic opposition in various ways. So there needs to be, and it's in a sense a separate, difficult discussion about what are the best strategies of the opposition to win the next election. But from my reading of political science of hybrid democracies, there are two main conditions. A smaller condition is to work for as high election turnout as possible. And there is some evidence that the higher the turnout, the higher chances for democracy. But most importantly, the opposition must be united. This united opposition doesn't win against the united incumbents. So the opposition must be united with all the political and ideological costs of unification, which basically means that the programmatic consensus is thinner if the coalition is broader. And at the extreme, the only common denominator for the coalition parties will be that they hate the incumbents, as was the case in Israel. I mean, the only common denominator for the opposition that win election is that they hated Netanyahu for all the right reasons. So these are two things. Fortunately, we have still a lot of time for it until 2023. Unfortunately, nothing shows that the opposition will come to the election.
One of the things, and I've been writing about this recently, law has to provide the guardrails on elections too. So it's not as though elections stand outside of the political framework, as we saw in the US in 2020. It is possible to distort law to the point that you can capture an election or attempt to capture an election. And so we think of elections as this great, saving force, but they're just as vulnerable as the courts and anything else to distortion and capture. I think we had something.
Okay. What do you think the impact on Polish society is going to be for the influx of a large number of Ukrainians and their ideological difference in terms of the support of democracy?
So the influx, I do not see any immediate answers in terms of impact on democracy. I can say that the impact on society will be enormous. I haven't been to Poland yet after Putin's invasion, but my family, friends, everyone tells me, look, you walk around Polish street, you hear Ukrainian almost all the time, which is nice because Poland has been one of the most monolithic, ethnically, linguistically, religiously societies in the world. Something I deplore, but something that many Poles celebrate. So we will have to learn, and I mean, many of these people will go either to Western Europe, return to Ukraine, of course, when peace comes, but many of them will stay. It's a good thing. I mean, Poles will learn to live with a difference. Not huge difference, because this is not a different religion, race, the language is similar, but still a difference. This is a different, and it's a good thing. It will teach, hopefully, it will help many Poles abandon xenophobia, which has been so dominant in Polish public life. In terms of your question was in terms of their ideological views, I really do not know this, because I do not know. I mean, we now have a tendency of looking at the Ukrainians through the prism of President Zelensky. And he displays all the right virtues of heroic and democratic leader. But democracy in Ukraine has a very weak pedigree, I mean, so I must confess to certain agnosticism. I don't know what.
Please, go ahead.
So I just wanted to return a question.
You want to stand up
Sure.
so we can hear you.
Kevin Patton, Russian East European Studies. I just wanted to return a question that you already posed, Professor Finkelstein, but I'm really interested in it, which is, why didn't this happen 40 years ago? What has changed in terms of world conditions to make it possible to supervene constitutions in places that we consider to be relatively stable institutionally? Are we just talking about the West? Are we talking about other places? I'm not quite sure. Like, is it like whatever postmodern skeptical reason? Is it changed media regimes? Is it we were just lucky? Is it changed economic situations? Right, we had like whatever the beautiful decades after the war, so things were good. Like, what is it that because there have been bad right-wing guys before in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere, but relatively few cases of places with liberal regimes where we have this the bad white right-wing guy decides to capture the entire state. But if the Constitution was no adequate guardrail, then why didn't it happen then? So I'm just interested in this larger historiographical question, and then that I think brings us back to the question of what do we do to reverse it? Right, getting back the opposition in power is great, but what do we do to reverse the larger conditions which lead to the possibility of populist takeover in the world?
Let me let Dan.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, what I'd say is, first, there's been breakdowns of democracy, of course, before. I think what might be different now than in the past is, first of all, the denominator is much bigger. Think because by 2006 we reached the biggest number of democracies we've ever had. So the base of number of countries that are democracies is bigger. So then when you have this increasing number of reversions or backsliding events, it's against the backdrop where there were more to choose from. And in a sense, the fact that a lot of the backsliding is occurring more along the lines that Professor Sadurski described here, whether in the Polish case, but there's similar trends in India, Brazil, etc. In a way, I think you can take that as a testimony to the normative power of democracy, because basically what's become less common is just coups, and although there's still some, but those kind of violent transitions. So now I think what we're seeing more of are these hybrid regimes where they sort of feel pressured by international norms, whatever. Well, okay, we have to stay sort of with the patina of a democratic regime, and that it kind of maintains some of those formal institutions, and that forces us then to go through this process of gutting them with this kind of rule of law takeover, right? Rather than just seizing power the way an aspiring autocrat might have in the past.
Well, this is of course the greatest question of them all whenever we talk about this populist upheaval around the world. So I just want to make a few points. First of all is that there is no such thing as a single phenomenon of populism around the world. There are different populisms, and they are wildly different. For example, scholars of populism in the US, I think the conventional wisdom at least is that largely it has something to do with globalization and therefore influx of migrants, but also mainly of cheap product and export of jobs and so on. But Polish or Hungarian versions of populism are not, apart from the immigrant issue, are not anti-globalist at all. So we talk about different populists. Secondly, political scientists like to distinguish between demand and supply forces. So normally, I think we tend to focus on demand. That is, why do societies elect populists? But I favor very much another side, and this supply. Why do populists occur in the first place, emerge as powerful politicians? Why did Donald Trump appear here at the time as hippie, and or Kaczynski? So these are issues which are much more contingent. And we really have to allow for the force of contingency. It didn't have to happen this way. I mean, in Poland, PiS won election in 2015 due to a number of completely contingent methods. Left-wing political parties in the parliament made some horrible mistakes in 2015, as a result of which they didn't get into the parliament. It was the only, I think, European Parliament with no left-wing party at all, because they made strategic mistakes. And they allowed their vote sort of de facto supporting this. This didn't have to work. Secondly, there was the refugee crisis in 2015 in Europe. And it was so easy to beef up this hatred and prejudice and dislike of, meaning refugee equals Muslim equals terrorist. That's what basically Kaczynski didn't have to happen this way. So there are all sorts of contingent issues, largely on the supply side, which I don't think are easily captured by grand explanations.
We are unfortunately out of time, with apologies to our online audience who may have had questions to feed into the discussion. I really want to thank both Professor Sadurski and Professor Kelemen. It was a great, very, very interesting discussion, especially your combined knowledge. This is a one taking your copy for a moment, but this is an absolutely wonderful book. Not only is it riveting and timely, but so beautifully written.
Thank you very much.
I very much thank you for writing the book and for coming and joining us here today. So
Thank you very much.
please join me in thanking.
We have catering lunch provided in this room if you'd like to pick up either a sandwich or salad. We also have books on sale outside, and Professor Sadurski will be out there to sign books momentarily.
Yes. The Russians, they get a lot of money from the Russians.